Okay, this is 5.1, Fundamental Trig Identities. We're going to take a look at reciprocal, quotient, and Pythagorean identities. Now, the reciprocal identities you should be pretty familiar with. We learned those in Chapter 4. Sine is 1 over cosecant, and so forth. Those are things that we are accepting that you are familiar with at this point. Let's look at the quotient identities, though. They're pretty important, and we have already touched on the fact that the tangent is the sine over cosine. Well, here's why. When we looked at our unit circle, we had a radius of 1. This was our y value, this is our x value, this we called r. We also found out that our y value was really just the sine of theta, and our x value was just the cosine of theta. Okay, so when we looked at tangent of our angle, we know that tangent is y over x. So now we know that tangent is also sine over cosine, because of what we just looked at there, that the sine is the y value and the x is the cosine value. Likewise, if you look at cotangent, the cotangent of the angle, well, that's x over y, and then you get that that's cosine over sine theta. So they are reciprocals, just like they were in the reciprocal identities. Tangent is sine over cosine, cotangent is cosine over sine. And those are some identities that you should have memorized or get memorized and be very comfortable using. We will use them all the time. Okay, now let's move on to the Pythagorean identities. We will keep using these ideas that we just had from our unit circle. Pythagorean identities, we're going to be using Pythagorean theorem. So on this right triangle here, I know that x squared plus y squared equals r squared. Well, if we're dealing with the unit circle, r is 1, so r squared is 1 squared, still 1. X was our cosine, so we have cosine squared of theta, and then we have sine squared of theta for the y. And there is your very first Pythagorean identity. And it doesn't matter, of course, whether you write the sine first or the cosine first. Doesn't matter. So that's the basic Pythagorean identity. Now the cool thing about these is that we can use this now, this sine squared theta plus cosine squared theta equals 1. And we're going to do some stuff to it, and we're going to get even more identities, like the last two that you see. So now if I take this, and I divide both sides by the cosine squared of theta. On the right-hand side is a little simpler. 1 over cosine squared. Well, cosine we know is related to secant. It's reciprocal. So 1 over cosine squared is really just secant squared theta. Then over here we have, I'm going to give that denominator to both pieces of my numerator. So sine squared theta over cosine squared theta plus cosine squared theta over cosine squared theta. And now I'm recognizing some things that I just had before. Sine squared over cosine squared is tangent. Sine over cosine, that was tangent. We just looked at that. So this is tangent squared theta. And cosine squared over cosine squared, well, that's just 1. So here's my next identity. Tangent squared plus 1 equals secant squared. So tangent squared theta plus 1 equals secant squared theta. Now if I start with that basic Pythagorean identity that we had before, which is that sine squared theta plus cosine squared theta equals 1. Now this time, I'm not going to divide by the cosine squared, I'm going to divide by sine squared. That gives me then on the right-hand side, 1 over sine squared is cosecant squared theta. And then on the right-hand side, or sorry, the left side, I'm going to do exactly what I had done over here and split it up. And I'm not going to avoid writing that out again, but I have sine squared over sine squared, that's 1. And then I'm going to take cosine squared over sine squared and look up above in your quotient identities. Cosine over sine is cotangent, so cosine squared over sine squared is cotangent squared. So this is 1 plus cotangent squared theta. Some hints about remembering how these go together. Well, the very first one isn't so bad. Sine squared, cosine squared. You know sine and cosine are always buddies. Okay, so they go together. And then on the other two, I remember that this time the c's from cotangent and cosecant, they do go together this time. Also notice that the ones that involve tangents, they're always needing a little help. They always have the 1 added to them. So your c's go together for cotangent squared and cosecant squared. And then, of course, that leaves tangent to go with secant squared. And on both cases, the thing that has tangent in it needs a +1 for a little help. And those are the identities that we expect you to learn and know by heart.